In this lecture, I want to talk about some of the alternatives to single-member district first-past-the-post electoral systems like the United States. We can't tell how well the electoral rules in the United States are working without comparing them to some alternatives. SMDFPTP is just one way to organize democracy, but it's not necessarily the most popular way to fill seats in the legislature. Indeed, worldwide, it's not. Most countries choose some form of proportional representation. We're going to look at three other important sets of electoral rules. Proportional representation, sometimes abbreviated as list PR, mixed member proportional representation, MMP, and the alternative vote. Now, these are just three of a very large and dizzying number of electoral systems across the world, but again, the purpose of this lecture is just to give you a flavor of what the main alternatives are, not to give you an overview of all possible electoral systems to which we could compare the United States. Let's recall some of the strengths and weaknesses of single-member district first-past-the-post systems like the United States. Some of its strengths is that it creates a clear legislative majority. Because it favors a two-party system, this is Duverger's law, SMDFPTP tends to create legislative majorities, which means that at least someone is nominally in charge and responsible for the direction of the legislature. Because of the single-member district phenomenon and the fact that there are districts, in fact, there is a clear local constituent responsibility of each congressperson. Each congressperson is responsible for the welfare of a very specific segment of the country, and this means that those constituents can appeal to a particular person to represent their interests in the national government. Another strength of single-member districts, first-past-the-post systems, is that it weakens the ability of the party to set its own agenda. Generally speaking, party organizations are grassroots, are bottom-up, and grassroots movements in the United States have historically played a very strong role in shaping the kinds of policies that a party is going to adopt on its platform. You just have to look at the Tea Party, for example, most recently with the United States, but that's not the only historical example. The point is that party organization tends to be more grassroots and therefore more representative of what the people think. It's also true that single-member districts first-past-the-post tend to moderate parties. This is an effect of the median voter theorem. The idea simply is that in order to win districts, you have to kind of create a broad tent coalition. If you want to win districts, you have to appeal to the center, because if you appeal to the fringes, you're not going to get enough votes. And so most political parties, their discourse ends up being moderating, and of course the old canard in American politics is that both parties sound the same, but there's a reason for that, and the electoral rules has a lot to do with that. What about weaknesses? Well, some of the weaknesses of SMD-FPTP systems. One, spoiler effects, right? The possibility that by voting for a third party, you will actually cause the party you prefer the least to come into office. We can also call this the Ralph Nader effect from the 2000 election. Many wasted votes, and wasted vote simply means a vote that doesn't help elect anyone. So it's not just votes for third parties that don't help elect anyone, it's also votes for any candidate who doesn't win in a district, right? If you are a Democrat in a red state or a Republican in a blue state, your vote never helps elect anyone, and so in effect your vote doesn't do anything in the political system. It represents a kind of wasted vote. We said that SMDFPTP is potentially disproportional, that is to say it's not especially representative, particularly of diffuse minorities, minorities that exist in some proportion in every district but are a majority in no district. These minorities tend to not get represented very well in these kinds of systems. One example might be gay Americans, for instance. It weakens party discipline. So on the one hand, by weakening parties, it means the parties don't get to set the agenda, but it also means that when there's a conflict between the interests of the individual representative and a conflict and the national party, the individual representative tends to do what he wants rather than follow the national party, and this is simply because there's a real conflict of interest here. What's best for the individual representative is to win his or her district. What's best for the party is to win the most number of districts, and that creates a conflict of interest that when it comes to individual decision making, the individual congressman may well buck his or her party. And finally, pork barrel spending, or earmarking, tends to be common. This is spending that favors local districts, or that is targeted at local districts rather than targeted at the country as a whole. Pork barrel spending tends to be important because in order to get congressmen to sign on to bills that might or might not help them or that might hurt them in their district, you have to offer them incentives. And that incentives to that district might be spending targeted at that district. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses of SMDFPTP, we'll have a chance to go over them a little bit more later, but let's compare. So what are alternate systems? Well, by far the most frequent and prevalent alternate system in the world is list PR. So how do you fill seats in the legislature in list PR? Well, you don't divide the country into districts. What you do is you have one big single national district, and you ask each party that wants to run to draw up a list. That's why it's called list PR. And this list contains a ranking of candidates ordered from 1 to however many seats they want to fill. And instead of asking citizens to vote for candidates, you ask them to vote for their preferred party. So they'll vote for the Socialist Party, or they'll vote for the Conservative Party, or the Christian Democrats, or something. And once they've voted for their party, and once the votes get counted, parties are going to get a number of seats that is in the legislature that is proportional to their total percentage of the national vote. So if the party got 23% of the national vote, then they get roughly 23% of the seats. And what that means is that they start at the top of their list and they seat as many candidates as constitute 23% of the seats. So in a 100-person legislature, then they would get 23 candidates and they would pick the top 23 people on their list. The top 23 would get seated and number 24 would be out of luck. If they'd gotten 24% of the vote, then number 24 would have made it. Most list PR countries have a minimal threshold that parties must meet of 5 or 10% before anyone in the party can be seated. So this helps exclude very small parties and helps avoid small parties having disproportionate effects in coalitions. Not all list PR countries have this minimum threshold, but many do. And the idea is to stop joke parties or single issue parties from being too influential. So briefly assessing list PR, and again, this is a very quick exercise. We could go into a lot more depth here, but it tends to remedy some of the defects of SMDFPTP type systems. It's very representative, so it tends to be much more proportional. There are no spoiler effects, so voting for your preferred candidate doesn't stop your second favorite candidate from getting elected. There are very few wasted votes. Everybody's vote, unless you voted for a tiny party that didn't meet the threshold, every vote helps get someone elected. There's no gerrymandering because there are no districts. There's no pork barrel spending, once again, because there's no districts, but more importantly, because parties have to care, parties and representatives have to care about serving national interests rather than local parochial interests. There's strong party discipline, and this is because parties get to decide who is on the list and who is where on the list. And because parties get to decide who's at the top of the list and who's at the bottom of the list, that means that as a politician, your strategic incentive is to cater to the whims of the party leadership so that you can stay on the list and keep your seat rather than get bumped down the list. And mavericks who buck the party tend to find themselves off the list entirely, or at least severely down the list, and then don't get elected. And so your self-interest is very much to follow the party rather than in an SMDFPTP system where your incentive is very much to win your district, regardless of what the party thinks. And another advantage of list PR is that it can ensure minority representation by having legal requirements, for instance, that 50% of the people on your list are women, for example, or that some percentage come from minority groups, or what have you. So the point is that list PR can ensure that minorities that would never win a district might still get seats because of the popularity of the party that they belong to. Of course, along with these strengths come some weaknesses. Because you can vote for whoever you want, there's often not two big parties, but there's often many parties, three or more. And that means that often there's no clear legislative majority. There's no one clear party that's governing, and no one clear party who can be held responsible for good and bad policies. Policies tend to be negotiations between coalitions of different parties with different goals, and that makes it harder to keep one person responsible. Furthermore, again, extremism is sometimes held to be a consequence of list PR, because extreme parties can join governing coalitions. It's sometimes necessary for some of the larger parties to draft smaller, more extreme parties into their coalition in order to get 50% of the seats in the legislature and therefore make policy. So extreme parties can sometimes have a disproportionate effect in list PR systems. Furthermore, list PR systems pay no attention to local concerns. List PR systems are only interested in national concerns, and of course there might be local groups that feel that they are being systematically oppressed by the country as a whole, and this is particularly true in ethnically diverse countries that employ list PR systems. So this was the case for Scotland within the United Kingdom, for example, that had a very strong national identity, but felt like the government, particularly in the 1980s, from London, was discounting their interests. And of course, because they were a numerical minority, they tended to see their interests take a back seat to the interests of the majority of the country, particularly England. And finally, it gives a lot of power to political parties, right? Political parties can discipline people within their parties and can tend to set the agenda a lot more effectively because of the fact that people are voting for parties themselves rather than candidates individually. So again, these are some of the weaknesses that come along with the strengths of list PR. There's a slight variation within list PR. There's also something called closed list. Well, closed list PR is what we just talked about, but there's also something called open list PR. Open list PR is where parties submit a long list of candidates, but voters vote for the candidates, not for the party. And the party still gets a number of seats proportional to its vote total, but it seats candidates not in the order that the party leaders selected them, but it seats candidates in the order of in which the voters selected them. This variation enables the people rather than the party to pick the candidates. Now, the difference is that in closed list, parties are stronger because you have to play nice with the party leaders to be higher up on the list. And the closed list can do this social engineering whereby women and minorities can be quote-unquote gerrymandered into the political system by requiring that a certain number of people are on the list, or a certain number of people from these groups are on the list. Open list, on the other hand, voters can pick who they want, so they can cherry pick. If they don't like women or if they don't like minorities, then they can just not vote for them. So that makes it impossible to make sure that women and minorities are seated in the legislature. Because voters can pick what they want, then parties are subsequently weaker, which is both good and bad. It's bad from the point of view of overcoming collective action problems in the legislature. It's good from the point of view of making sure that the parties are maximally responsive to the desires of their constituents. So, quick and dirty comparison. PR can ensure that women and minorities are represented, if it's closed list anyway. Spread out minorities are certainly better represented, so if you have environmentalists or communists and you have a few of them in each district, PR can make sure that their concerns make it to the national legislature. And of course, national issues that affect everyone, are going to be more salient because political parties have to compete based on how well they serve the interests of a very large population, the entire district, which is the entire country. First past the post can help minorities that are concentrated geographically if they're willing to gerrymander minority districts, which the United States has roughly done. But they can't help minorities like women who, are more or less 50% everywhere, but are victims of discrimination by voters. And so you can't ensure an FPTP system that you get any number of women in the legislature. And by the way, the statistics confirm that. In the United States legislature, you don't get many more than 17% women, but you do get a fairly proportional number of African Americans, for example. Concentrated minorities can be represented. We talked about that. Those that are geographically close together. So, for instance, Mormons are fairly proportionally represented in the United States House because many of them live in geographically concentrated areas. And finally, local issues in pork barrel spending are going to be more likely because, again, you have to satisfy district interests in order to get national legislation passed. So sometimes you have to negotiate by giving away favors to local groups and local districts in order to make sure that party interests get served. Okay, a second alternative to SMDFPTP, is mixed member proportional, MMP. And this is also called semi-proportional systems. And this is basically a combination of list PR and single member districts. The country is divided into districts, and half the legislature is filled through first past the post single member district voting. But the rest of the legislature is elected at large via list PR. And Germany is the leading example of this, although Japan also employs something like this. And the semi-proportional systems means that you have two votes. You vote once for a party and once for a candidate, and it doesn't have to be the same party, or the candidate doesn't have to be from the same party as you voted for the national election. So each individual has two votes and votes once for a local representative and once for a party that represents their interests nationally. And this is a way of kind of combining a concern for local interests with a concern for national interests. Now, some mixed systems like Germany compensate for disproportionality in district reps by giving parties that didn't win districts outright extra seats from their national list. Thus, they make the overall legislature more proportional. That is to say, some members are going to be representing districts, but if some parties win a lot more districts than others compared to what they would proportionally get based on their share of the national vote, the parties that have a disproportionately low number of seats get more seats from the list PR side of things, and thus balancing out the legislature. But there's other mixed systems that don't compensate, and these systems are much more disproportionate, like Japan, where you can get very disproportionate results in an MMP system. So the degree to which MMP systems are proportional or disproportional depends on whether they do this balancing or not. If we assess MMP, well, if there's balancing, then it's proportional. It can also ensure minority representation through the list PR system, but it can also ensure constituent service. So it can do both. It can balance national and local interests quite well, and that's, I think, what makes it primarily attractive. But it's still liable to multi-party legislatures, but less than full PR. Gerrymandering is still possible with the districts. Spoiler effects are still possible in the district system, and pork barrel is still possible. But again, the effects of all of these things are moderated compared to full-on SMDFPTP systems. So it's a kind of balancing act, and many countries have decided they want to balance between the advantages of both systems. And of course, they also get the disadvantages of both systems, as well as the advantages. The final system we're going to look at is the alternate vote system. And I say it's a system, but really it's just a variation on SMDFPTP. And this is used in Australia and other countries as a frequent modification to SMDFPTP. You still have some single member districts, but unlike SMDFPTP, in the AV systems, voters rank candidates in their districts in their order of preference. So you don't just vote for one candidate, you basically order the candidates in your order of preference, kind of like ballots for MVP in sports leagues in the United States. You just rank your top choices, right? Now, once first place votes are counted, the candidate with the fewest first place votes gets eliminated. The ballots of that candidate are then reallocated to other candidates based on their second choices. So the second choice of the voters who voted for the candidate with the fewest first place votes get treated as first place votes and get reallocated among all the other candidates. Then the newest candidate with the fewest first place votes is again eliminated, and the process repeats. And then at some point, some candidate will receive over 50% of the vote, and at that point, you can stop because no other candidate can catch him. So what happens is that you have this repeating process of elimination where the least popular candidates have their votes reallocated to other candidates in proportion to the preferences of the voters. So let's look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of the alternative vote system. Well, it's got all the strengths of first past the post, for sure. But it adds some extra strength. There's no wasted votes, right? If you voted for an unpopular candidate, your vote still counts. It's just going to get reallocated to your second favorite choice, which means you avoid the spoiler effect. You have no wasted votes, and you avoid the spoiler effect. You don't have to worry that by voting for your favorite candidate, you're going to cause your least favorite candidate to get elected. It also eliminates the need for primaries if you don't want to have them. That is to say that, if we look at the current presidential primary in 2015, on the Republican side, there's 5 or 6 candidates. You wouldn't necessarily have to have a nominating convention for a single candidate. All you'd have to do is let Republican voters vote for whoever they want in whatever order they prefer, and the electoral system would sort out which candidate ultimately gets elected by simply transferring second and third and fourth place votes of a candidate up to the one that they prefer. Okay, so it's got all the weaknesses of FPTP, but no wasted votes or spoiler effect. So it's basically a modification of FPTP with a few added benefits. However, and some of you may feel this, it's possibly confusing in the sense that the way votes are counted isn't always so clear to the people who are voting, and as a result, a lot of people just don't like it because they're not entirely sure how it works. Now, I don't know if that's a valid criticism, but it is true that it is better for a political system to be transparent, that is to say easy to understand, than non-transparent. And of course, the more non-transparent it is, the more possibilities people have to make adjustments that the voters don't understand in order to distort their preferences in some way. But overall, it seems to be a clear improvement. The AV seems, on the face of it at least, clearly superior to FPTP in the sense that it's got all of its strengths and weaknesses, but it's got all of its strengths and loses a couple of the weaknesses. MMP, on the other hand, is kind of a compromise between ListPR and FPTP. It shares the strengths and weaknesses of each, and ListPR probably just reflects different political priorities than FPTP. ListPR focuses more on national issues than local issues. It's more representative of popular opinion. There's a stronger desire to make every vote count, and there's a willingness to allow parties a certain amount of latitude, a certain amount of discretion in how they set agendas and discipline their members and candidates.